My name is Harper. I am 29. 2 months ago, Diane texted me the night before Vanessa's engagement dinner, not because I had done anything wrong. She wrote, "The venue has a strict head count. It would be easier if you stayed home. You understand, I was holding carving chisels I had just bought for my 10-year-old niece, Mia." I read the text twice. I did not reply. I slipped my phone away. Where and what time is it for you as you listen to this? I just kept walking. I did not cry when I read Diane's message. Crying requires a fracture in your expectations, a sudden shock to the system that leaves you gasping for air. But you cannot be shocked by a storm you have been living inside for 20 years. You simply learn to carry an umbrella. Or in my case, you learn to build a roof of your own. I walked out of the hardware store, the heavy paper bag containing Mia's new carving tools swinging gently against my leg. I climbed into my truck, a reliable, battered thing that smelled perpetually of turpentine and old pine, and started the engine. The drive back to my workshop was quiet. I did not turn on the radio. I let the low hum of the tires on the asphalt fill the silence. It is fascinating how families like mine operate. Diane had a vision for her life, a perfectly curated, sterile gallery of a life, and everyone had to play their assigned role to remain on display. Vanessa was the centerpiece. She was the golden child, the PR director with the flawless blowout, and the wealthy fiancé. I was the rough draft that Diane tried to erase. I looked down at my hands on the steering wheel. They were calloused. There was a faint smudge of dark walnut stain permanently embedded under the edge of my left thumbnail. Diane hated my hands. She used to look at them as if I had dragged mud across her white carpets. She spent my entire adolescence trying to force me into silk blouses and high society luncheons, hoping the sheer proximity to wealth would somehow wash the dust off my skin. When I refused to conform, she simply stopped inviting me. I pulled up to the heavy, iron-reinforced doors of my studio on the edge of the city. It was an old textile mill I had bought and retrofitted. The exterior was brick and ivy, unassuming and quiet. Diane had never been here. Vanessa did not even know the address. To them, I was just Harper, the girl who played with wood in some dusty garage, the embarrassment they kept hidden from Julian's aristocratic family. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air here was different. It was thick with the scent of raw cedar, linseed oil, and the quiet dignity of hard work. I set the bag of tools down on my heavy workbench. I ran my fingers over the smooth, sanded edge of a half-finished mahogany corbel. They thought my silence was submission. They thought my absence from their glittering world meant I had failed to launch. They did not understand that I had not been exiled. I had evacuated. The shop was perfectly still. I turned on the overhead lamps, bathing the massive space in warm, golden light. I looked around at the blueprints pinned to the walls, the massive slabs of reclaimed timber waiting to be given a second life. I felt no anger toward Diane in that moment. Anger was a waste of energy. I had something far more powerful than rage. The shop held my secret. They assumed I was barely scraping by. Whenever Diane was forced to mention me at her social club dinners, she would use a tone dripping with manufactured pity. She would say, "Harper is doing some sort of carpentry work. She has a little hobby shop." It was a convenient lie. It protected the narrative that Vanessa was the only successful daughter. I never corrected her. I never corrected anyone. When you are building a kingdom, you do not need to announce the laying of every stone. You simply let the castle rise. Under a completely different business entity, a quiet, discreet brand known only to the wealthiest historical preservation boards in the country, I was a lead architectural restorer. I did not build modern glass and steel monstrosities. I breathed life back into history. I dealt with 18th century crown moldings, hand-hewn structural beams, and the kind of intricate craftsmanship that most modern contractors cannot even begin to comprehend. My clients did not care about social media followings. They cared about pedigree, precision, and absolute discretion. For the past 36 months, I had been consumed by a single, monolithic project. It was the most grueling, demanding work of my entire career. I spent nights sleeping on a cot in my office, my hair coated in plaster dust, poring over century-old architectural schematics. I coordinated teams of master masons, stained glass artisans, and structural engineers. I fought with city zoning boards. I tracked down the exact quarry in Italy that had supplied the original marble in 1890. It was a $12 million restoration contract. The property was a legendary, sprawling 19th century estate that had sat decaying for decades. When the new owners purchased it, they wanted it transformed into the most exclusive, high-end event venue in the state. They hired me because of my reputation for uncompromising authenticity. I gave them everything I had. I personally carved the missing sections of the grand staircase. I spent 6 weeks formulating a custom stain to match the original heart pine floors. I knew every nail, every hidden joint, every creak of the floorboards in that massive house. It was my masterpiece. It was a tangible, immovable testament to what I could do with my own 2 hands. Diane and Vanessa knew nothing about this. To them, success was a brand name handbag or a photo op at a charity gala. They could not fathom a success that was quiet. A success that required you to wear steel-toed boots and negotiate with hardened construction foremen at 6 in the morning. They did not ask about my life, and I had long ago stopped offering them pieces of it to judge. I walked over to the drafting table in the center of my shop. Spread across the surface were the final, approved schematics for the estate. The project was officially complete. The keys had been handed over to the owners just 1 week ago. I traced the intricate lines of the floor plan with my index finger. I had built something permanent. I had built something undeniable. My work spoke for itself. I moved away from the drafting table and walked toward the small kitchenette in the corner of my shop to brew some coffee. On the counter, half buried under a stack of material invoices, lay a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was the original invitation to Vanessa's engagement dinner. It had arrived in the mail weeks ago, before Diane had decided my presence would be a liability. I picked it up, feeling the heavy, expensive weight of the cardstock. Vanessa's fiancé, Julian, came from old money. The kind of money that Diane had spent her entire adult life trying to orbit. Julian was not a bad person, but he was insulated, unaware of the sharp edges of the world outside his trust fund. Diane was terrified that my rough hands or my lack of designer clothing would somehow break the illusion she had carefully constructed for Julian's parents. She needed everything to be flawless. She needed the venue to communicate an undeniable, historical prestige. I slid the invitation out of the envelope. The gold foil lettering caught the light. I read the elegant script detailing the location of the dinner. Diane had bragged to a mutual acquaintance that she had secured the most sought-after new venue in the state. She had paid $45,000 just to rent the space for a single evening, desperate to prove that our family belonged in the same stratosphere as Julian's. My eyes locked onto the name of the venue printed in bold, sweeping calligraphy. The Magnolia Estate. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The coffee machine hissed and sputtered behind me, but I did not hear it. I stared at the words until the letters blurred. Diane had rented the Magnolia Estate. She had paid a small fortune to host the most important social event of Vanessa's life inside the very walls I had just spent 3 years rebuilding. The irony of it was so sharp, so perfectly poetic, that it almost felt orchestrated by some unseen hand. Diane had banned me from the dinner because I did not fit her aesthetic. She had told me to stay home because I was not refined enough. Yet, the roof that would shelter her, the grand floors she would walk across, the carved pillars that would serve as the backdrop for all her boastful photographs, they were all mine. Every inch of that prestige she was trying to borrow had been forged by my hands. I set the invitation down on the counter. A strange, deep calm settled over me, anchoring me to the floor. I did not feel the urge to call her and scream. I did not feel the need to ruin the surprise. The truth is far more devastating when it reveals itself naturally, without any prodding or pushing. I poured my coffee into a mug, watching the dark liquid swirl. Diane was going to walk into my masterpiece tomorrow night, completely blind to the reality of where she was standing. She was going to try and impress a room full of billionaires using my blood, my sweat, and my silent dedication. I smiled to myself. People often ask me why I never fought back earlier. When they hear about Diane's text message, they want to know why I did not immediately drive to her house, kick the door open, and demand the respect I was owed. They do not understand the mechanics of long-term emotional starvation. When you grow up in a house where affection is a transactional currency, you learn to survive on very little. Vanessa was the investment. She was beautiful in the exact way Diane valued: compliant, image-obsessed, eager to wear the matching outfits and smile for the country club cameras. I was the wild weed growing in the manicured lawn. By the time I was 8 years old, I realized that my natural inclinations building treehouses, taking apart old radios, coming home with dirt on my knees were offensive to my mother. At first, I tried to change. I wore the itchy dresses. I sat quietly with my hands folded in my lap. But the approval never came. It was never enough. So, somewhere around age 12, I stopped trying. I retreated to the dusty, detached garage behind our house. It became my sanctuary. I taught myself how to use a hand plane. I learned how to identify wood grains by smell. Diane called it acting out. I called it building a fortress. This is the invisible chain of the survivor. You learn that resistance only brings more criticism, more exhaustion. If I argued with Diane, it validated her belief that I was difficult and dramatic. If I fought Vanessa for the spotlight, it only made Vanessa shine brighter in Diane's eyes. So, I chose the only defense mechanism that actually worked: absolute, impenetrable silence. I let them have the spotlight. I let them have the narrative. I became a ghost in my own family, appearing only at holidays, nodding politely while Diane cataloged my flaws disguised as maternal concern. I accepted the hand-me-downs. I accepted the canceled invitations. I accepted the role of the disappointment because it gave me the ultimate freedom. When no one expects anything from you, nobody watches you work. You can fail in private. You can experiment in private. You can build an empire in the dark without anyone demanding a piece of the foundation. The learned helplessness they thought they had instilled in me was actually a cover. I was not helpless. I was simply waiting. I took a sip of my coffee, looking around my massive, successful studio. The chain had held me in place for years, keeping me anchored to the shadows while Vanessa basked in the sun. But the thing about spending your whole life in the shadows is that your eyes adjust. You learn to see things clearly while everyone else is blinded by the glare. I did not fight Diane over a dinner invitation because I no longer cared about a seat at her table. I had already bought the building. The silence was my shield. There was only one person who ever looked at my dust-covered clothes and saw something valuable: my grandfather, Arthur. He was the founder of the family architectural firm, a man who believed that buildings possessed souls and that a true architect was merely a translator. While Diane obsessed over the profit margins and Vanessa practiced her networking smile, Arthur spent his evenings in his personal workshop. I was the only one allowed inside. I remember being 9 years old, standing on a wooden crate to reach the heavy workbench. He handed me a piece of raw cherry wood and a block of sandpaper. He did not tell me what to make. He told me to listen to the wood. Diane thinks architecture is about throwing money at a space until it looks expensive, he would say, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. But legacy is not what you show off to your neighbors. Harper. Legacy is what stands long after they have stopped looking. He taught me the difference between a dovetail joint and a mortise. He showed me how to read the rings of an oak tree. He was my protector, my mentor, and my only ally in a house that felt like a museum exhibit. When he passed away 5 years ago, the house grew entirely silent. Diane immediately took over the firm's board, steering it away from historical preservation and into lucrative, soulless modern developments. The only piece of Arthur that remained was his wife, my grandmother Cora. Cora was a retired librarian with sharp eyes and a fierce, quiet intelligence. She lived in a small cottage on the edge of town, having refused to move into the sterile mansion Diane had insisted upon. Cora knew everything. She watched the way Diane treated me, and though her age prevented her from fighting daily battles, her presence was a steady anchor. She was the one who kept Arthur's memory alive. She was the one who reminded me that I was not the problem. I missed him every single day. I missed the smell of his pipe tobacco mixing with the sharp scent of cedar, but I carried him with me. I inherited his hands. I still used his vintage block planes. The brass was worn smooth from decades of his grip, and now it was wearing to fit mine. In the world of true craftsmanship, money cannot buy a steady hand or a patient heart. I looked toward the back of my studio. My eyes rested on the heavy, steel fireproof safe tucked beneath a drafting table. Arthur had known exactly who Diane was. He had known exactly what she would do the moment he was gone. He had left me more than just skills. He had left me a shield. I never forgot his final lesson. It happened 5 years ago, just 2 weeks before Arthur's heart finally gave out. The family had gathered at the hospital, Diane weeping dramatically for the nurses while Vanessa frantically texted her public relations team about the funeral arrangements. I had been sitting quietly in the corner, staring at the sterile linoleum floor, when Arthur's attorney walked into the room. His name was Vance. He was a tall, uncompromising man who wore conservative suits and rarely smiled. Vance asked Diane and Vanessa to step out of the room. Diane was furious, demanding to know what secret business was being conducted. Vance simply closed the heavy oak door in her face. When we were alone, Arthur gestured for me to come closer to the bed. His breathing was labored, but his eyes were entirely clear. He looked at me with a mixture of immense pride and profound sorrow. Vance unclasped his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, manila envelope sealed with red wax. He handed it to me. It felt incredibly heavy in my palms. "Diane is going to ruin the firm," Arthur whispered, his voice barely a rasp. "She is going to sell out the history for quick cash. She thinks she owns the foundation." He paused, coughing weakly. "But the foundation is not the brick. Harper, the foundation is the intellectual property, the core designs, the proprietary restoration techniques." I stared at the envelope. I did not fully understand what he was giving me. "This is an irrevocable trust," Vance explained quietly. "It cannot be altered, challenged, or undone by your mother. It transfers the total ownership of your grandfather's core architectural patents and proprietary designs directly to you. Your mother controls the business entity, but she does not own the soul of the work. You do." Arthur reached out and squeezed my hand, His grip was remarkably strong for a dying man. "Do not tell them," he instructed. "Do not show them this envelope. Let Diane think she holds all the cards. Let her play her hand. You will know when it is time to open it. Open it only when this family crosses the line." I had promised him I would. I took that envelope home and locked it inside my steel safe. For 5 years. It sat in the dark. For 5 years. I watched Diane systematically strip the character from the family firm, turning it into a mass production machine for wealthy clients with no taste. I watched Vanessa parade around as the heir apparent to an architectural dynasty she did not understand. I kept the combination to the safe entirely to myself. There were days when the temptation to open it was almost overwhelming, days when Diane publicly belittled my career choices. It took a massive amount of discipline to bite my tongue, but Arthur had taught me patience. A woodworker knows that rushing a cure will ruin the finish. You must wait for the exact right environmental conditions. Now, standing in my quiet workshop with the discarded invitation to the Magnolia Estate on my counter, I realized the moment had finally arrived. Diane had not just crossed the line, she had demolished it. The lock was waiting. The profound silence of my studio was broken by the sound of a tentative knock at the side entrance. It was a Saturday afternoon, just hours before Vanessa's extravagant engagement dinner was scheduled to begin. I walked over and pulled the heavy iron door open. Standing on the threshold, looking entirely out of place in a stiff, powder blue designer dress, was my 10-year-old niece, Mia. Mia was Vanessa's daughter from her first, short-lived marriage. She was a quiet, highly observant child with constantly bruised knees and pockets full of interesting rocks. In other words, she was Diane's worst nightmare realized for a second time. "Mia," I said softly, stepping aside to let her in. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be getting ready for the dinner." She walked into the shop, her small shoulders immediately dropping as the scent of cedar washed over her. She pulled a small, jagged piece of pine from her dress pocket. "Mom was yelling at the catering staff on the phone," Mia mumbled, not meeting my eyes. "She said I was in the way. She said my hands were dirty." She held up her small fingers. There were tiny smudges of graphite on her fingertips from sketching. My chest tightened. The words were a flawless, agonizing echo from my own childhood. Vanessa was simply repeating the cycle, passing down the exact same toxic pursuit of aesthetic perfection that Diane had forced upon us. Mia was not allowed to be a child. She was required to be an accessory. I walked over to my workbench and picked up the paper bag from the hardware store. I pulled out the beginner's set of carving chisels I had bought that morning. They had smooth wooden handles, perfectly sized for smaller hands. I set them on the bench next to a soft block of basswood. "Come here," I said. Mia's eyes widened as she approached the heavy bench. She looked at the polished steel chisels with absolute reverence. "Are these for me?" she whispered. "They are yours," I confirmed. "But they stay here in the shop. This is your safe place. Nobody cares if your hands get dirty in here." I spent the next hour showing her how to hold the tool, how to let the sharp blade glide through the grain rather than forcing it against the wood. She was a natural. She had the exact same quiet focus that Arthur had recognized in me 20 years ago, watching her relax, watching the anxiety drain out of her posture as she focused entirely on the wood. I felt a fierce, protective resolve solidify in my gut. Diane and Vanessa had tried to erase me, and I had survived. But I was not going to let them erase Mia. I was not going to let them strip the creativity out of her just so she could fit into their shallow photographs. I owed it to Arthur to break the cycle. I owed it to the little girl I used to be. I wiped a smudge of sawdust from her cheek. I knew exactly what I had to do. Mia smiled at me. to fully grasp the audacity of Diane hosting this party at the Magnolia estate. You have to understand exactly how I left the family business. I did not simply walk away to find myself. I was systematically pushed out. After Arthur passed away, Diane immediately appointed herself the chief executive officer, Vanessa. Despite having zero architectural background, was made the director of public relations and client acquisition. I was 22, fresh out of a rigorous architectural preservation program, armed with Arthur's training, ready to work. I lasted exactly 14 months. Diane was obsessed with courting the ultra-wealthy tech developers who were flooding into the city. These were men who wanted historical aesthetics without paying for any of the actual history. They wanted cheap, mass-produced materials masked by expensive paint. When I flatly refused to sign off on a project that involved ripping out original, load-bearing mahogany beams to replace them with hollow fiberglass imitations, the silent war began. Diane called me into her corner office. It was decorated in aggressive beige, completely devoid of character. She looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. "Harper, you are making things very difficult," she had said, casually adjusting her designer watch. "Our clients do not care about the structural integrity of a beam they cannot see. They care about the turnaround time. You are slowing down the process." "I am preserving the building," I replied calmly. "That is what this firm does." "That is what this firm used to do," Diane corrected sharply. "Furthermore, your appearance is becoming a serious liability. Vanessa brought Julian's father to the site yesterday, and you were covered in plaster dust. You look like a day laborer. It does not project the luxury image we are selling." She did not fire me outright. That would have caused gossip, and Diane hated gossip more than she hated sawdust. Instead, she suffocated me. She removed me from all lead projects. She reassigned me to cataloging archive files in the windowless basement. She excluded me from every client meeting. It was a clear, unmistakable message: conform to my aesthetic, or disappear entirely. I chose to disappear. I packed up my drafting tools, my grandfather's vintage block planes, and I walked out the front doors without saying a word. Diane and Vanessa celebrated my departure as a massive victory. They thought I had surrendered. They assumed I would quietly fade into obscurity, perhaps taking small handyman jobs to pay my rent. They never bothered to check what I actually did next. They never asked about the massive commercial loan I secured, or the abandoned textile mill I purchased under an anonymous holding company. They were so blinded by their own superficial success that they forgot one fundamental truth about builders. When you lock an architect out of a house, she does not stop building. She simply goes somewhere else and lays a new, much stronger foundation. Their ignorance was my greatest advantage. I built my own empire. Rebuilding a life from scratch is not glamorous. It does not happen in a cinematic montage set to uplifting music. It happens in the quiet, brutal hours of the early morning when your muscles ache and your bank account is dangerously close to empty. For the first 2 years after leaving the family firm, I worked entirely in the shadows. I took on complex, high-risk historical restorations that other contractors refused to touch. I worked under an exclusive brand name, Heritage and Oak, keeping my personal identity completely detached from the marketing. The Magnolia estate was the defining turning point. It was a massive, decaying property that had been abandoned for over 50 years. The new owners were foreign investors who demanded absolute perfection and utter discretion. They interviewed a dozen prestigious firms, including Diane's. They rejected Diane because Vanessa's presentation lacked any technical depth. They hired me because I walked into the meeting, unrolled a set of hand-drawn schematics, and told them exactly how the original architect had designed the load distribution in 1882. The project consumed my entire life. I spent 3 years breathing plaster dust and negotiating with specialty lumber yards. There were weeks when I slept no more than 4 hours a night. I stood on scaffolding 50 feet in the air, personally inspecting the restoration of the ceiling frescoes. I earned the respect of my crew not by demanding it from a corner office, but by picking up a sledgehammer and working alongside them in the sweltering heat. The seasoned foremen, men who had been in the trades for 40 years, stopped calling me the designer and started calling me boss. It was grueling, physical, exhausting work. It was everything Diane despised, and it was incredibly beautiful. I watched the estate transform from a rotting relic into a breathtaking masterpiece of 19th century grandeur. Every time I carefully stripped away a layer of cheap, modern paint to reveal the original, flawless mahogany underneath. I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of my own identity. I was restoring the truth. I was removing the artificial layers that people use to cover up real quality. The finished venue was immaculate, featuring sweeping staircases, enormous crystal chandeliers, and a grand ballroom that felt like stepping back in time. As the estate neared completion, the buzz in the architectural community grew. Architectural Digest requested an exclusive feature. They wanted the face behind heritage and oak. I agreed to the interview on the strict condition that it would not be published until the project was entirely finished and the keys were handed over. The writer had asked me, during our final sit-down, what inspired my relentless pursuit of authenticity. I had looked at the tape recorder on the table and answered honestly. I learned early on that people will try to paint over your foundation to make you fit their aesthetic. The only way to survive is to build something so solid, so undeniable, that their paint simply chips away. That interview was now in print. The ink was already dry. The grand ballroom of the Magnolia Estate was a cavernous, echoing space that demanded absolute perfection. When the foreign investors first purchased the property, the structural supports were severely compromised. The original architect had designed 4 massive, ornate pillars to hold the weight of the vaulted ceiling, but decades of rot and neglect had ruined them. The investors had suggested replacing them with steel columns wrapped in modern, manufactured veneer. I flatly refused. To compromise the structural skeleton of a 19th century estate is to strip away its dignity. I told them I would recreate the pillars using the exact methods employed in 1882, or I would walk away from the contract. They gave me full creative control. For 6 months, those 4 pillars became my entire world. I sourced old-growth mahogany from a specialized reclamation yard down in Georgia. The wood was incredibly dense, heavy, and unforgiving. Diane would have hired a cheap contractor to run the wood through an automated CNC router, prioritizing speed and cost over authenticity. Vanessa would have simply focused on how the pillars looked in the background of a photograph. I did it the way Arthur had taught me. I set up scaffolding in the center of the dusty ballroom. I brought Arthur's vintage chisels and heavy wooden mallets to the site, day after day. I stood 40 feet in the air, wearing a respirator mask and heavy work boots, manually carving the intricate floral motifs into the dense mahogany. My shoulders ached constantly. The skin on my palms cracked and blistered, bleeding into the sawdust. There is a profound, almost spiritual rhythm to carving solid wood by hand. You cannot force the blade. You have to understand the grain, reading the microscopic variations in the timber to know exactly how much pressure to apply. It requires a level of patience and silent dedication that Diane's world of instant gratification could never comprehend. I was not just shaping wood. I was resurrecting a ghost. I spent 400 hours on those pillars alone, The other contractors on the site would walk past my scaffolding, shaking their heads in quiet disbelief at the sheer physical labor involved. They did not understand that I was not doing this for the investors. I was doing this to prove a point to myself. When the final coat of protective wax was applied and the scaffolding was finally dismantled, the pillars stood as towering monuments of true craftsmanship. They were flawless, commanding, and undeniably authentic. They anchored the entire estate, demanding respect from anyone who walked into the room. They were the very definition of a legacy built through sweat, rather than bought with inherited money. I stood in the empty ballroom, staring up at the intricate woodwork. I felt a deep, resonant connection to my grandfather in that moment. I had taken the skills he entrusted to me and used them to build something that would outlast us all. The wood remembered his name. In the elite circles of historical architectural restoration, true artisans do not advertise their involvement with glaring billboards or flashy brass plaques. We operate by a much older, quieter code. We leave a maker's mark. It is a tradition dating back centuries, a way for master craftsmen to silently claim their work without disrupting the aesthetic purity of the building. Arthur had his own maker's mark. It was an intricate, highly specific crest, a traditional draftsman's compass interwoven with a single, detailed oak leaf. He had used it only on the projects he considered to be his absolute best work. When Diane took over the firm, she immediately retired the crest. She deemed it too old-fashioned and replaced it with a sleek, minimalist, corporate logo that looked like it belonged to a hedge fund rather than an architectural firm. Diane thought a legacy was a logo printed on a glossy brochure. She did not understand that a true legacy is carved into the foundation. On the final night before I handed the keys of the Magnolia estate over to the investors, I stayed late. The massive house was entirely empty, illuminated only by the soft glow of my portable work lights. I walked into the grand ballroom, my boots echoing softly against the newly finished heart pine floors. I knelt at the base of the grandest mahogany pillar, the one facing the main entrance. I pulled a small, custom-forged steel stamp from my leather tool roll. It was Arthur's original maker's mark. I had rescued it from his desk drawer the day after his funeral, long before Diane could throw it into the trash. I positioned the steel stamp carefully against the dark wood, just a few inches above the floorboards, in a spot that was visually unobtrusive, but perfectly accessible if you knew exactly where to look. I picked up my heavy wooden mallet. With one sharp, decisive strike, I drove the steel into the mahogany. I pulled the stamp away. The crest, the compass, and the oak leaf was now permanently embedded into the wood. It was barely an inch wide. It was a silent, undeniable signature proving that the techniques, the dedication, and the soul of Arthur's original firm had survived. It proved that the true architectural bloodline ran through my hands, not through Diane's corporate office. Anyone who merely wanted a pretty background for a party would walk right past it. Diane and Vanessa would never notice it, because they only looked at surfaces. They only saw what they wanted to see. But a true collector, a genuine connoisseur of historical architecture, would recognize that mark instantly. They would know exactly what it meant and the caliber of craftsmanship it represented. I ran my thumb over the indented wood, feeling the sharp edges of the crest. I packed up my tools and walked out of the ballroom, turning off the lights one by one. I locked the heavy front doors of the estate, leaving my silent guardian behind. It was hiding in plain sight. Saturday morning arrived with a cool, pale gold light filtering through the high windows of my studio. Today was the day. 40 miles away, in a sprawling suburban mansion. Diane was undoubtedly orchestrating a chaotic symphony of hairstylists, makeup artists, and frantic caterers. Vanessa was likely throwing tantrums over the exact shade of the floral centerpieces. They were preparing for the ultimate performance, desperate to prove their worth to Julian's aristocratic family. I was standing at my workbench, wearing faded denim overalls and an old t-shirt, calmly pouring a cup of black coffee. Mia was sitting cross-legged on a stool nearby, her brow furrowed in deep concentration as she dragged a small chisel across her block of basswood. The shop was filled with the comforting, rhythmic sound of metal scraping against timber. It was perfectly peaceful. I had no desire to be anywhere else. At exactly 8 in the morning, a heavy thud echoed from the loading dock door. I walked over and found a thick cardboard package left by a courier. The return address was a publishing house in New York. I carried the package back to my desk and sliced it open with a utility knife. Inside were 10 pristine, advance copies of the latest issue of Architectural Digest. I pulled the top magazine free. There it was, a full-page, vibrant photograph of the grand ballroom at the Magnolia Estate. And standing in the center of the room, looking directly into the camera with an expression of quiet, absolute authority, was me. The headline was printed in bold, elegant typography across the bottom. The silent architect Hal Harper revived the Magnolia Estate. The feature was a massive 10-page spread. It detailed my relentless dedication to historical accuracy. It praised Heritage and Oak as the premier restoration firm in the country. More importantly, the article explicitly outlined my journey, noting my independent rise and my sole ownership of the firm. It was undeniable, nationally recognized proof of my success. Most people in my position would have immediately taken a picture of the cover. They would have posted it on social media. They would have sent a smug, passive-aggressive text message to Diane, ensuring she saw exactly what she had thrown away. I did none of those things. Validation is a strange currency. When you spend your whole life begging for it, you think it will feel like an explosion. But when you finally build a life where you no longer need it, validation just feels quiet. I did not need Diane to see the magazine to know my worth. The estate was real. The work was finished. The ink on the glossy pages was dry. I looked over at Mia. She blew a pile of sawdust off her woodblock and held it up proudly, showing me a slightly lopsided but perfectly recognizable carved star. I smiled warmly at her. I picked up my phone, switched it to silent mode, and tossed it casually into the top drawer of my desk. I poured another cup of coffee. The rest of the day passed in a comfortable, productive rhythm. I spent the afternoon teaching Mia how to properly sharpen her chisels on a wet stone, guiding her small hands to find the perfect angle against the abrasive surface. We ordered a large pepperoni pizza for dinner and ate it sitting on the loading dock, watching the sunset paint the industrial skyline in shades of bruised purple and dark orange. I did not think about Vanessa's engagement dinner. I did not picture the string quartet playing in the corner of the grand ballroom I had built. I did not imagine Julian's wealthy parents evaluating the expensive catering Diane had fought so hard to secure. The entire event felt like a movie happening on a screen in another room, loud, chaotic, and entirely disconnected from my reality. Around 11 o'clock, Mia finally succumbed to exhaustion. She fell asleep on the vintage leather sofa in my office, her fingers still loosely clutching a piece of sandpaper. I draped a heavy wool blanket over her small shoulders, turned off the main overhead lights, and walked over to my desk. The shop was dead quiet. I opened the top drawer and retrieved my phone. The screen immediately lit up with a chaotic, aggressive barrage of notifications. The little red bubble over my Messages app displayed a staggering number. I unlocked the device and scrolled through the log. There were 14 missed calls. 7 were from Diane. 4 were from Vanessa. 3 were from Cora. My thumb hovered over the screen. Diane never called me unless she needed someone to blame for a logistical failure. Vanessa never called me unless she needed a favor she could later deny asking for. But Cora was different. My grandmother was a creature of strict routine. She went to bed at 9 o'clock every single night. Cora never called after 10 unless someone had died, or the world had fundamentally shifted on its axis. I bypassed Diane and Vanessa's frantic, escalating text messages. I did not read a single word they had typed. Instead, I tapped Cora's name and held the phone to my ear. I stepped out onto the cool concrete of the loading dock, the chill of the night air biting through my thin t-shirt. The line trilled softly in the darkness. I expected it to go straight to voicemail, assuming Cora had finally surrendered to sleep after trying to reach me. I braced myself for the automated greeting. The phone rang only once. Harper. Cora's voice cracked through the receiver the instant the call connected. She sounded breathless, her tone vibrating with a strange, turbulent mixture of shock and suppressed triumph. It was not the voice of a woman mourning a tragedy. It was the voice of a woman who had just witnessed an earthquake. "I am here, Grandma," I said quietly, leaning against the cold brick wall of the studio. "What happened?" Cora took a ragged breath. "Why didn't you tell me? Harper, why didn't you tell anyone what you had built?" I closed my eyes. The magazine. "You saw the article." "Julian's mother saw it first," Cora corrected, a sharp edge of disbelief cutting through her words. She proceeded to explain the spectacular collapse of Diane's perfect evening. Julian's mother, Eleanor, was a renowned collector of antique architecture and a board member of several historical preservation societies. During the cocktail hour, Eleanor had wandered over to admire the grand mahogany pillars in the center of the ballroom. Eleanor had bent down to examine the grain, and because she was a true connoisseur, she had spotted Arthur's maker's mark, the compass, and the oak leaf carved at the base. Eleanor recognized the crest immediately. Cora whispered. She pulled up the digital edition of Architectural Digest on her phone. The feature had gone live an hour before the party started. She walked straight up to your mother, held up the screen with your face on the cover, and congratulated Diane on having such an extraordinarily talented daughter. I let out a slow, steady breath. "What did Diane do?" "She panicked," Cora said, her tone dropping into disgust. "Diane tried to save face in front of the billionaire in-laws. She smiled and told Eleanor that the Magnolia estate was a family firm project. She lied. Harper. She looked Julian's mother in the eye and said you were just an apprentice who helped the lead contractors. Have you ever had someone try to take credit for your hard work? Let me know in the comments below if this resonates with you." "But the article is very clear," I said calmly. "Exactly," Cora replied. "Eleanor is not a fool." She read the first paragraph out loud, the paragraph that explicitly states you are the sole owner of Heritage and Oak, and that you personally executed the restoration independently. Diane was caught in a desperate, pathetic lie in front of the exact people she was trying to impress. Julian's family looked at her as if she were a con artist. Diane had built a fragile house of cards, relying on my silence to maintain the illusion of her superiority. She had brought the most important people in her life into my sanctuary, intending to use my work as a prop for her own vanity. She had underestimated the permanence of the truth. The illusion had finally shattered. I ended the call with Cora and stood in the quiet chill of the loading dock for a long time. The night air was thick with the scent of damp pavement and distant exhaust fumes. I looked down at my phone. The screen was still illuminated, displaying the chaotic list of desperate notifications from my mother and sister. They had realized their mistake, but in the world of narcissists, a mistake is never an opportunity for an apology. It is simply an obstacle that must be immediately paved over and blamed on someone else. I tapped the voicemail icon and selected the audio message Vanessa had left exactly 12 minutes ago. I pressed the phone to my ear. There was a sharp intake of breath, followed by the sound of Vanessa pacing. Harper, I do not know how you managed to sabotage my engagement dinner without even showing up, but you did, she hissed, her voice vibrating with a shrill, entitled fury. Julian's mother thinks Diane is a liar. Julian is asking questions about the firm's finances that we cannot answer right now. You humiliated us on purpose. I listened, perfectly still. I did not interrupt the recording. I simply analyzed it. You knew we were hosting the dinner there. Vanessa's voice continued, rising in pitch. You knew how important this was to me. You deliberately hid the fact that you owned the restoration company just to make us look like fools in front of Eleanor. Diane is having a panic attack in the bridal suite. We have spent years building a pristine reputation for this family, and you are trying to destroy it out of petty jealousy. She paused. I could hear the sharp clack of her heels in the background. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted from anger to a cold, demanding authority. It was the exact tone Diane used when giving orders to her subordinates. We are going to fix this, Vanessa dictated. You are going to come to the family office tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Our lawyers have drafted a transfer agreement. You will sign over the Magnolia Project rights to the family firm. We will issue a joint press release stating it was a collaborative effort and that Diane was the silent visionary behind it. It is the only way to save my wedding and repair the damage you have caused. The voicemail beeped and disconnected. I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at the screen. The sheer, staggering audacity of the demand was almost clinical. They had excluded me from the celebration, lied about my life's work to inflate their own social standing, and now, having been caught in their own fabrication, they expected me to simply hand over a $12 million masterpiece to save them from embarrassment. They did not view me as a sister or a daughter. They viewed me as a resource to be harvested. I did not feel a sudden surge of rage. Rage is a chaotic, blinding emotion. What I felt was a cold, precise clarity. I walked back inside the studio, the heavy iron door clicking shut behind me. I walked past the drafting tables, past the racks of curing lumber, and headed straight for the back office. They wanted a surrender. The city outside my studio was completely silent, buried under the heavy stillness of 2 o'clock in the morning. I did not feel exhausted. The adrenaline of absolute certainty was a powerful stimulant. I opened my email and typed the address for Vance, Arthur's attorney. I attached the scanned copies of the irrevocable trust, along with a link to the digital feature where Diane had publicly claimed my independent architectural work as her own. Diane has publicly claimed ownership of independent assets produced by Heritage and Oak. I typed, please initiate the immediate termination of the IP licensing agreement as outlined in Section 4 of Arthur's Trust. The assets revert to me, effective immediately. I pressed send. By the time they woke up to demand my surrender, the legal machinery would already be in motion. The trap was perfectly set. By 8:30 the next morning, the heavy iron door of my working woodshop was shoved open. Diane and Vanessa stepped over the threshold, invading my sanctuary in their tailored silk and designer dresses, their expensive shoes immediately collecting a layer of fine sawdust. Vanessa slapped a thick manila folder onto my drafting table, a non-disclosure agreement, and a retroactive intellectual property transfer. They wanted me to sign over my life's work to cover up a lie Diane had told because she was embarrassed by me. They promised a junior partnership, insisting it was the only way to save Vanessa's lavish wedding and the family firm's reputation. I am not signing this, I stated calmly, ensuring Mia, who was hiding in the back office with noise-canceling headphones, was safe from their chaotic crossfire. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the thick, red wax-sealed envelope Arthur had given me 5 years ago. Arthur did not leave you the firm, Diane. He left you the limited liability company, the empty shell. I placed the irrevocable trust directly over their useless NDA. I explained the trap they had walked blindly into. Arthur had placed 70 years of historical molds, proprietary curing formulas, and patented structural designs into this trust, making me the sole beneficiary. Diane had only been operating under a strict licensing agreement when she permanently voided the exact moment she publicly misrepresented the origin of my assets. The blood drained from Diane's face as the devastating reality pierced her carefully constructed delusion. From this moment forward, she had no product left to sell. Narcissists do not accept defeat gracefully. 3 days later, a courier delivered a massive binder from Julian's elite legal team, threatening to invalidate the trust by claiming Arthur was mentally incapacitated. I did not panic. I simply called Vance. He immediately sent them the unedited, high-definition video of Arthur signing the documents, flanked by 2 independent board-certified geriatric psychiatrists confirming his absolute mental clarity. Within 15 minutes, the elite law firm formally withdrew their representation, citing a sudden conflict of interest. Vanessa's expensive attempt to rewrite history evaporated into thin air. The collapse of Diane's empire was a slow, methodical, structural failure. Julian's aristocratic family, abhorring public scandal and fraud, broke the engagement. The commercial developers pulled their lucrative funding when Diane could no longer guarantee the historical authenticity she had advertised. The corporate banks initiated emergency audits, called in the commercial loans, and quietly put the sleek, glass-walled office building up for auction. Diane had spent decades building an empire of paper and glass. Now, the wind had finally changed direction, and the paper blew away. 6 months passed, and the transition from survival to genuine peace settled over the studio. My independent firm, Heritage and Oak, secured massive new contracts. But my most important expansion was intensely personal. When the firm collapsed, Vanessa spiraled into a self-destructive vanity, entirely neglecting her 10-year-old daughter. I hired a family law specialist and successfully petitioned for educational and physical guardianship of Mia. I bought a second, smaller drafting table for my office. Every morning, we watched the sunrise and talked about wood grains and structural integrity. I had built my empire so the next generation would never have to hide their hands in their pockets. One crisp October afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Diane. "Harper, darling, we need to present a united front. I think it is time we sat down for coffee. There are some temporary financial bridges we need to cross." There was no apology, just a calculated pivot. To a narcissist, you are never a person. You are simply a supply. I felt absolutely nothing. I tapped the small information icon, pressed block caller, and permanently deleted the 20-year thread of passive-aggressive manipulation. I stood alone in the center of the main workshop floor under a warm, golden pendant light. For a very long time, I believed my value was tied to Diane's perception. But a flawless mahogany pillar does not need an audience to hold up the roof. It stands because its foundation is true. You build differently when you build without an audience. You build without compromise. Legacy is not what you inherit. It is what you protect. And what you build in the silent, unglamorous hours when absolutely nobody is watching. I do not need their applause to validate my architecture. I know my own name.